works at the Office for Refugees, Archdiocese of Toronto. And he and his colleagues, it's a wing of the Catholic Church that does refugee sponsorships. He and his colleagues are seriously angels on earth. They have saved more lives than you can even imagine. They have been doing this work for years, completely under the wire, without being recognized or acknowledged, and only now that refugees are so much in the public discourse, they're really starting to get their due. And I just want to acknowledge you, Luciano, for all the work that you do. It's So what we're going to do is I'm going to talk about the issue of the Middle East refugees on a sort of a higher level, and Luciano is going to really talk about the nitty-gritty of resettlement of refugees in Canada and how does that really work, and what are the options for integration of refugees, especially with this 25,000 that are coming in very short order. Waking up this morning, I can imagine that you might find it pretty easy to feel jaded about the state of the world today. At this moment, the world is in a state of conflict, which is on a pretty much unprecedented level. Conflicts between countries, communities within countries, religious groups pitted against each other. It seems pretty depressing. And as we're sitting here now enjoying ourselves tonight, there's a huge civil war in Syria, which continues to rage on and has been going on for a number of years before anybody ever talked about it in the media in Canada. It's pitting a dictator against his own people. It's pitting religious factions within Syria against each other, Muslims against Christians, and even outside Syria, it has really polarized the rest of the world with different countries holding different opinions, and it's threatening the entire balance of power in the Middle East. There seems to be no winning strategy, because if you support Assad, you're supporting a dictator. But if you support the rebels, they are mostly religious extremists. So you're between a rock and a hard place. There's no good party and there's just no good party. There's no white knight here. So the so-called Arab Spring, about which we all hear so much, I mean, at the beginning it seemed like it was so wonderful and it was an uprising of the people for democracy. They were throwing at a dictator. But what happened is that created a political vacuum in many countries in the Middle East. And of course, the people who were best placed to exploit that political vacuum, unfortunately, were very well organized religious extremists, including terrorists. We're so lucky to live in Canada, as Terry said earlier, where conflict never really touches us. I mean, we hear about it. The odd time we'll get involved into a conflict, but it never really touches us. And some of us are, like me, for example, we're citizens by an accident of birth, just pure luck. And others in the room, maybe you chose Canada as your country exactly because of the peace that exists here in Canada. And actually 6.8 million Canadians were born outside of Canada. That's a pretty staggering statistic. 6.8 million Canadians are foreign born. And I'd be remiss, of course, if I didn't mention the thing that sort of started this whole political discourse in Canada, which was the photo of the little boy on the beach, Elan Kurdi. In the middle of the election, it became a lightning rod for discourse about Canada's role in the Middle East crisis. What should we be doing? What were we doing? What weren't we doing? And with all the various political parties, how much spin they put on the issue in all directions, it's not surprising that the general public is completely confused about it and doesn't actually really know what to believe. And I think as an immigration refugee lawyer, that's where I can play a little role in giving a piece of education. So when the story initially broke in the news, some of you might remember, the facts were actually incorrect. A member of parliament had reported to a news agency that this family had tried to sponsor the little boy and his family to Canada, and because they were refused, that's how this tragedy happened. And this was actually completely wrong. If you ask me, I actually think that the member of parliament who did that probably owes an apology to the Minister of Immigration. But the one good thing that came out of it is it started everyone talking about the magnitude of the refugee crisis. Because this had, again, I'm going to reiterate this again, this has been going on for years. This is not a new problem. But all of a sudden, everybody was talking about it. So let's start by saying, first of all, that Canada has really done a lot on the world stage. And especially with regard to the Middle East refugee crisis. Contrary to what you may have heard in the media, Canada has already done a lot. Jason Kenney, who was then the Minister of Immigration at the time, opened up significant spaces, for example, for sponsorship of Iraqi refugees. And over the past few years, there have been about 25,000 Iraqi refugees that have come to Canada since approximately 2008. And a lot of them, of course, came to Canada with the assistance of the Office for Refugees, Archdiocese of Toronto, and Luciano was directly involved in that mass movement. Nobody really talked about that, but actually this has been going on for a number of years. We also committed $810 million in international aid to the Syrian crisis alone. And we are, so far anyway, this looks like it may stop soon, engaged in a military combat mission to try to stem the problem from where it starts, which is in Syria itself, against ISIS. So before this whole story hit the media, Canada had already made a commitment to bring 10,000 refugees. However, it was going to be staggered out over a longer period of time. And it really bothers me actually when I see, the media is full of hyperbole. It's either you're doing everything or you're doing nothing, or it's totally right or it's totally wrong. It really bothers me when I see the media saying, well, under the previous government, they weren't doing anything to help refugees. In fact, that wasn't true. However, having said that, it's equally false to say that we were doing enough and that we couldn't do more with the resources that we have. So let me explain that. You'll often hear it said in various circles that Canada is so generous that we take in the most refugees per capita of any country in the world. You'll hear that all the time. On Twitter and social media, you'll hear it all the time. But it's actually untrue unless you spin the numbers in a very disingenuous fashion. What do I mean by that? Well, it is true that Canada accepts 250,000 new immigrants approximately every year. That's a big number. That's about a 1% population growth for the entire country every year. However, refugees actually are only about 1/10 of that number. The rest of them are economic immigrants or people who came sponsored as members of the family class. They're not refugees. In fact, in 2014, Canada took 23,286 refugees. Okay, it's a lot smaller number than a lot of people may imagine. And that's where it gets even more interesting, because from those 23,286 refugees, only 12,300 of those were actually brought to Canada voluntarily through either government or private sponsorship of refugees. The other 50% of those were people who made it here on their own, and when they reached Canadian soil, they made a refugee claim, which the government then has to adjudicate that by virtue of international law. So our generosity actually in 2014 amounted to only about 12,300 people. Those numbers are surprising for some people. And that's the global total for refugees, okay? 12,300 for the whole world, not only Middle East refugees. So that would be like Africa, like Latin America, all of those places. So for Syria specifically, we processed only 700. Germany in the same time period took 30,000. Okay, those are pretty stark numbers when you compare them to each other. And that's on a per capita basis. If you looked at it from the perspective of number of refugees to GDP, we're not even in the top 15, not even close. And these numbers are from the UNHCR, by the way. Okay, so they're not from some crazy left-wing think tank or whatever. Those are from the UNHCR. And also, you have to contrast that as well. If you compare Canada to countries that host refugees but don't necessarily grant them full asylum rights like we do in Canada. For example, if you look at countries like Turkey or Lebanon, they host refugee populations in the millions every year. Lebanon has a population, the whole country, their population is 4 million. They're hosting 1.4 million refugees right now. That's over a quarter of their total population. Okay, in the West, we get one boatload and the media goes ballistic. Imagine 1.4 million people showing up all of a sudden just like that. So if we compare those numbers, we're really actually not even on the charts. We're not even close. And we also have to consider that, we're not talking about apples and apples, because when we talk about a country like Turkey, Turkey is not giving these refugees infrastructure, is not absorbing them into society. They're mostly kept in camps. Whereas in Canada, when refugees come here, we give them permission to work, they can live in society, they can get social benefits if they need them. So it's, you kind of, to be fair, you're not exactly talking about the same thing. But then it gets more complicated because we also have our security to worry about. And please don't fool yourselves, okay? Don't get polarized by this issue of what has happened over the last week. Places like Beirut, France, among other places. neither one of the polar opposite positions is correct. Okay, it is not true that there's a gang of marauding militants that's waiting to invade Canada. Okay, that's not true. It's equally untrue that there aren't militants mixed up in this group. So let's not be naive. There are people that are mixed into this population who do have a militant background. So while we must be generous, we must also be very careful. It's interesting because all of these things that I'm talking about security, I actually wrote this speech quite a few weeks ago, before any of this happened. And it's interesting now, like in the light of what happened last weekend, it's actually coming out to be even more germane at this moment. And many advocates, and you'll also see it in the news, they talk about, well, I don't understand, during the Vietnamese conflict, we brought in so many people, we brought them in by boats and we resettled them, and what about Kosovo in 1999? You know, what grand moment for Canada, we brought 5,000, we sent planes, we airlifted them, why can't we do that? Well, we're in a post-9/11 world. We didn't have those same problems in those times that we do now. We didn't have those serious security problems. The problem that you have to look at is that if we do airlift people in, once their boots hit the ground here in Canada, they have full constitutional rights. So if there is a militant among them, good luck getting rid of that person once they arrive here, because international law will prohibit us from deporting that person to a situation where they could be killed or tortured. So it's not really a great idea to say, well, just bring them over and let's sort it out after they get here, because by then it could be too late. The other thing you have to consider is that the idea is to put them in military bases. Okay, fine, but again, constitutional rights, that means that as soon as you confine them, they have a right to a bail hearing within 48 hours. 25,000 bail hearings within 48 hours. Can you imagine? We don't have the capacity to do it. So, I mean, needless to say that I'm very much in support of bringing 25,000 refugees. I just think that the idea of bringing them by the end of the year is not only realistic, it's foolhardy. And I would encourage you to, you know, but let's not go too far the other way. Some people are saying cancel the plan altogether. No. You have to help the people who are in genuine need. But there's no objective reason to rush this to the point that we are, so that the security of our country will be compromised. There's no reason. The people who are coming to Canada that are being brought in by the Canadian government, we're not bringing them out of Syria where they're in danger. They're already outside of Syria. They're sitting in Lebanon, they're sitting in Turkey, they're sitting in Jordan. And while their conditions may not be wonderful, they're not in danger of losing their life. We're not rescuing them from the jaws of death, so to speak. So there's no objective reason to rush this so fast to have it all done by the end of the year. So I'll just wrap up now. I mean, I guess probably what I want to say in summation is that, I mean, it's interesting when you see these people that have come to Canada as refugees. I mean, you always get that portion of people that will, you know, sort of close in on themselves and just say, you know what, I just want to forget everything and put it behind me, and I don't want to ever think about this again. But you get a good proportion of them that will somehow manage to pull themselves together and do amazing things in this country and add so much to our social fabric, and sometimes go out and start organizations or initiatives to help other people who are in the same problem. So let's not forget about these people. This is going to fade from the headlines in a few weeks. But I want you to keep it in the top of your mind that these people really need our help. Let's not abandon them in their time of need. What we need to temper that with our proper security checks. Thank you.